today we have Tom Locke, who is our subject matter expert, and he's had 20+ year career in film and television on both sides of the camera. He teaches screenwriting and film production at Columbia University, Wesleyan, BU, and many other schools throughout the country. And of course, Thomas helped and worked with Forster Thomas for, Forster Thomas Educational Consulting for many years. And he's helping our candidates successfully navigate their way to acceptances at virtually every top film program or conservatory throughout the nation and many others, across the United States. And some of you actually may know Tom either from partnering with us or as the series lead, you heard it right, in MTV's first ever primetime drama. So at this moment, I am going to give it all over to Tom Locke. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Evan. I doubt any of you, though there's many of you on this meeting, I doubt any of you would remember me from MTV's first ever primetime drama, but thank you for the kind introduction. So as Evan said, my name is Tom Locke. I work pretty extensively with Forster Thomas on creative portfolios for film students applying to MFA programs and BFA programs as well. And we can certainly talk about both of those as this session goes on. I'm going to share my screen and I'm just going to walk you through many of the basics when it comes to portfolios and how you can help your candidates put themselves in the best positions to gain admission to the best programs. And as I said, much of what we talk about today will be MFA focused, but most of it applies to BFA as well. There's obviously nuances, and certainly if anyone has any questions about that in the end, we can talk about it. But generally speaking, when it comes to the creative portfolio, we're going to talk about both MFA and BFA in the same light. So let me just back up here. So let me give you the quick and the dirty. Okay, this is what generally goes into a film portfolio. And as many of you know, I'm sure, schools are trying more than ever today to differentiate themselves from other schools. They want to know if your candidate is going to apply to, Chapman, they want to know that they really want to go to Chapman, not that they were able to throw in an application to Chapman because it's basically the same portfolio as every other school, right? So this is the quick and the dirty, though, in general for film portfolios. There's a cinematic personal statement. This is different from the Common App essay. This is different from supplemental essays that they may write for the school. This is something that warrants its own conversation and its own session. We're not really going to get into that today. Okay. And then we go to pre-existing screenplay materials. So there are several schools that want a pre-existing sample of a screenplay or something that the candidate chooses to write during the application process. Columbia is certainly well known for this. Give us your 10 best pages, essentially, of screenplay. Okay, so the screenplay material is going to be really important, and working with a candidate on a portfolio, you're often, coming into this where they've written all this stuff and you're going to be reading pages and pages and pages and trying to help them figure out what is their best material. And there's occasions. I had a candidate a couple years ago. We'll actually talk about her a little bit later in this session. She wanted to apply to graduate film schools. She had never done anything. And the first time that she sent me any screenplay material, she had no idea how to even format it. She didn't know what Final Draft was. She didn't know what any sort of screenwriting software was. And, you show that to NYU or USC or any top film school, and, it's not going to work. So you're going to get a wide range of what people give you, but ultimately they're going to need a good pre-existing screenplay sample for many schools. And that brings us to the prompted writing exercises. These are sometimes the most fun things to work on with candidates, and they're super important. And they're important in ways that candidates might not think about ahead of time. These are generally scene exercises or dialogue exercises where the school will give you a prompt that says something like, interior night, New Year's Eve. One person walks out of an apartment and is waiting for the elevator. They step into the elevator. There's another person already in there. The elevator doors close. Now write the scene. Okay, and you have like 3 pages. Columbia does this, NYU does this. You have 3 pages, or so, depending on the school, to complete that scene. So with these prompted writing exercises, they're gauging, can you tell a story visually, or are you leaning far too heavily on dialogue? And a lot of people think screenwriting and good storytelling is quippy banter, right? Or quippy dialogue. Aaron Sorkin made us feel this way. David Kelly made us feel this way, right? But ultimately, the schools are looking for, does this person know how to tell a story visually? And less dialogue is actually more. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Film treatments or concept. Okay, many schools, virtually every top film school is going to ask you for some sort of treatment or concept, which is generally speaking a one-page synopsis on a story that you would like to create at some point later on as a feature film. Creative resume, that's going to ask candidates to go through basically any creative project that they've been involved with. Doesn't always have to be film. This is especially true in BFA applications. If they've been involved in other types of artistic endeavors, they want to know about that on these creative resumes. And then the visual sample. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about the visual sample today. What makes a good visual sample? What does not make a good visual sample? And that's probably a great segue to the next couple slides. Let me just move us forward. I put this little chart up here, not for anybody to really garner anything specifically from it, except this. I have every one of my clients and candidates build a chart like this when we start. And the reason for it is, there's an obvious organizational and logistical way of getting everything on the page in front of us and seeing what we have to do. But the real reason is this: where can we be efficient? Okay, your first challenge in this process is efficiency. How and where can we become efficient? If we choose, if we have an option at Chapman of two different stories to write, and we write story A, and story A isn't going to help us with any of these other schools. Okay, but story B might also help us with the requirement for USC, then we're going to choose story B every time, and we're always going for maximum efficiency. And the reason for that is really twofold. I don't know how many of you work with candidates and what your sort of fee system is, but if you're working hourly with a candidate, that actually saves everybody time and money, and candidates really appreciate that. But at the same time, it prevents headaches for you and headaches for the candidate. It is a lot of work to put together strong portfolios. And if you're not finding ways to sort of double dip where you can and be as efficient as possible, you're just going to be doing that much more work, especially when you get into candidates who are applying to 5, 6, 7+ film schools. All right, let's move from the chart to so what do you do and what don't you do? Okay, and this is with an entire portfolio, but also sort of with the visual sample as the heart of the portfolio. These are some of the mistakes that I see candidates make all the time. And those of you who've worked with film candidates before, I'm sure you've seen some of these as well. First of all, ambition. Ambition is a wonderful quality. Okay, we all admire it and we all have it, at different points in our lives. Your creative portfolio for film school is not the time to be overly ambitious. All right, I said this is not The Fabelmans, right? Steven Spielberg, as many of you know, has this movie, The Fabelmans, coming out in November, and it's sort of his lifelong opus. And I deal with a lot of candidates who want their lifelong opus to be that thing that they submit to NYU or USC, because this is the school they've dreamed of all along, and to give themselves the best shot to get in, they have to submit this masterpiece. And it is the number one way to have your candidate taking themselves down the tubes during this process. All right, ambition is not their chance to make their opus. There are very specific things that we'll talk about that they should do in a creative portfolio and the creative portfolio visual piece. Okay, production value. This is a huge myth. Right. Everybody wants huge production value in their films that they're going to submit to schools. Right. There's an old joke. I worked with a cinematographer on a project who was from Tisch, who, by the way, Columbia and Tisch are both amazing. They actually share a lot of faculty. But I worked with this guy who was a cinematographer from Tisch, and he said, yeah, the joke used to be become a really good cinematographer and Columbia students will hire you to shoot their films. Right. Many schools, Columbia known for its storytelling in particular, They are looking for your ability to tell a story visually. They can teach you all the things you need to generate production value. Okay. But they want you to be able to tell them, this is how I know how to tell a story. I know a beginning, a middle, and an end. I know a protagonist. I know struggles that they have to overcome. And I can tell that visually in a simple way for a film that's probably going to be less than 5 minutes. Okay. There are some schools that will include an option in their portfolio for, 8 images. If you don't have a film to show us 8 still images that tell a story, right? And I think that highlights the focus for many of these schools. It's not about the production value. It's not about how pretty your film is. You could shoot something that's beautiful that doesn't have a good story, and you're not going to get into these schools. You can shoot something on an iPhone, and we'll talk more about that. But you can shoot something on an iPhone with natural light, and you can get into virtually every top film school in the country. Okay, so production value, very, very, very important to consider, and usually very important to sort of make your candidates understand is something they don't need as much of as they think to have a competitive application. Awards are great. There's a place to list them. Creative resumes, there's all these great places to list them. But I'm going to be honest with you, these admissions committees are comprised of faculty members, professional filmmakers, people who have won awards, real awards, people who've won Sundance, people who've won Academy Awards, right? People who've won Emmys. They're going to believe their own eyes, and they're going to trust their own eyes. So you may have this film that may have won, the East Brunswick, Renegade Film Festival. And, that's wonderful and that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a great piece to submit for your creative portfolio. Okay. I had a guy a couple of years ago, and he had done legitimate work. He had been a producer on 2 documentaries that went to Sundance. He had he had shot several commercials, high-end commercials, a Nike commercial, things like that. And he had a lot to show. And many of you might know, for Columbia's MFA program in particular, they allow you to send up to 30 minutes of material. And he sent me a reel, and it was 27 minutes long. And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, you have about 8 minutes of amazing stuff on here. And then you have another 19 minutes or so of pretty good stuff, or even good stuff, right? But I see no reason to send 19 minutes of good stuff when you can send 8 minutes of amazing stuff. And, that took a lot of back and forth to sort of talk him down from the pressures of submitting a lot of material. And, the more things you give them, the more things you give them to say no to. So only send your best stuff. Okay. Big ideas. This kind of goes with ambition, right? This is, I had this idea for this film and it's amazing. I'm actually working with a candidate right now, and he's a great candidate and he's super talented, but he wants to make this 3-minute film that involves a car chase and a murder in a hotel and finding a dead body in the woods, and this sort of this venture that these characters are going on. And these big ideas are not necessarily conducive to a 3-minute film. And you're going to see this over and over with people applying to BFA programs or MFA programs. In my screenwriting classes at Columbia and Wesleyan, I deal with this all the time, right? You're dealing with smart kids, and smart kids have big ideas, right? And they want to make, I'll have them write a nine-page screenplay, 6 to 9 page screenplay. And, in that 9-page screenplay, they're trying to write a feature, right? Don't do that. Encourage them to keep it simple. The big ideas are for after film school, or the big ideas could maybe be for their thesis films, right? But that's it. Keep it simple. And that brings me to the last one, complicated. Complicated and complex are not the same thing. Okay. And that's really a really important distinction to understand. And it's a really important distinction for you to help your candidates with. Many times you will get candidates who think they're going to be really clever and send a film that has a really unique twist, right? Something like, for those of you who've seen The Sixth Sense, right? We find out at the end of the movie that Bruce Willis has been dead the whole time. Okay. That's great in a feature film. That's great if you're really, really skilled at that. But in a 5-minute film that you're submitting for a portfolio, if you are going to have this unbelievable twist that your entire movie rides on, everything in it has to set you up to that twist. And oftentimes what that does is it makes the story complicated, not complex. You're not delving into the character. You're not delving into what that character wants or what that character is trying to accomplish. And you're just sort of clouding the waters. And I have seen so many portfolio films that are predicated on a twist that just don't work. They never pay off. So I always encourage them to let's not complicate it. Let's go for complex. Complex means digging into your protagonist and hopefully making us feel something. So what wins, right? Story sensibility. Story sensibility wins every single time. These schools are in the business of training storytellers. And if they have a sense that you understand how to tell a story, how to tell it visually, and that you have something interesting to say, you stand a really good chance of doing well in this process. Let's go to the next slide. And that is, what do you do? Okay. What do you do for these storytelling sensibilities to come across? Well, storytelling sensibility involves, can you tell a story? Can you tell it visually? Do you understand things like conflict, structure, journey? Do you lean on plot and dialogue too much? We talked a little bit already about leaning on dialogue too much, right? And quippy banter and smart dialogue. You can lean on plot too much too, right? Too much plot and not enough story. One of the things that you can do when working with candidates and thinking about this plot versus story thing, even if you're not a film person, right? When they're sending you some of this material and you're looking at it and you're reading it, ask yourself, as the different plot points happen in their story, are you connecting those events by the words "and then"? Or are you connecting those events by "but" and "therefore"? Okay. They want their stories, events to be connected by "but" and "therefore." That means that they have sort of cause and effect relationships that are happening between the events in the story, and they're connected, right? Creating a much larger overall story, okay? If it's "and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened," they have too much plot, not enough story, not enough why behind the events that are happening, okay? And they're going to have a less effective storytelling portfolio, which is going to hurt them in this process. So what are we looking at this through the lens of, right? Again, we're looking at this through pre-existing screenplay material. We're looking at it through prompted writing exercises. We're looking at it through film treatments or concepts. By the way, this is where the "but" and "therefore" and the "and then" really reveal themselves. And this is part of the reason that schools like to have these film treatments or concepts, right? These 1-page synopses or 2-page synopses of a film that they want to make. They can read those, they being the admissions committee, they can read these film treatments and film concepts, and they know if somebody understands how to structure a story. And as you're reading these synopses, if you sit there and you go, it's just event after event, and it's "and then, and then, and then," even if they're not actually writing that, but that's what you're feeling reading this series of events, you have somebody who's not really engaging in the kind of storytelling that's going to work well in this process. But if you can encourage them to connect their events more causally, and that's going to probably involve them pulling out some of those events, they're going to come up with a much better film treatment or a much better film concept. Visual sample, visual sample is, let me just back up for 1 second. Visual sample is really where this all comes together. And like I said, we're going to show a couple clips at the end, and each one has a different reason for me to share it today. But ultimately, it's, can you take all of this into consideration? And if I could give you one overarching thought for today, is help your candidates simplify their approach to the creative portfolio. Okay, so does their story have a simple structure, right? Short films are generally about one thing. Short films are not metaphors. Short films are not, these, big sort of literary comparisons to the way you would sort of engage in a novel. Short films are kind of dirty and down and sexy or I'm sorry, not so sexy, right? And just sort of linear, right? I'm a character. I want this. I have obstacles facing me. I'm going to either get that thing in the end, or I'm not going to get that thing in the end. And hopefully I learn or grow from it. Okay. And that, if you can do that, you have a chance in this process, and you probably have a pretty good chance, because that's really the storytelling sensibility that they're looking for. Now, with the visual sample, can you tell it visually? Okay, that's really your key. Do you know how to take that story through its beats from a visual perspective and help people get your point? Right. And that's where the metaphors really become problematic. Right. And again, this is something certainly at schools like Columbia and Wesleyan, when I'm teaching undergrads, they all want to write screenplays about, metaphors or using other literary devices in screenplay world. And it generally doesn't work. Okay. With somebody making a film for a creative portfolio, if they're just being really simple and they're not clouding the waters, then the film is not going to be, and this is a word you're going to hear a lot from a lot of candidates if you haven't already, experimental. Okay. Experimental films, unless it is just so unique and unbelievably different from anything you've ever seen, experimental films generally will not work very well in this process. Okay, why? Because experimental films usually get caught up in a metaphor, right? This is a metaphor for society, or this is a metaphor for this, or a metaphor for that. And they're going to make this film that they're not telling a story. They're trying to communicate an idea in a film. A film is about a story. A film is not about an idea, right? So that film becomes quote unquote experimental. And then everybody goes, ooh, wow, it's experimental. It's great. But then these storytellers, really good storytellers on these admissions committees at schools like NYU and, USC and Columbia and AFI and places like that, right? They're sitting there and they're looking at this and they're going, this is not a storyteller, right? And once in a while, again, if that person is just so unbelievably talented and it's so unique, it's like Baz Luhrmann, right? Okay, fine. But there's not many Baz Luhrmanns that we're all going to be working with applying to graduate or undergraduate film school. Okay. And they need to understand screenplay structure and screenplay format. And if they don't, then they need to learn it really fast. And I'm going to talk about that one girl in a second, who is a great story about that. So the other thing that I wanted to make sure I had a little time to touch on before, we look at a couple clips and then we get to questions, is this is something I run into a lot with film school candidates, is do they really know the schools? Do they really understand what these schools are about? Okay, if any of you have worked with MFA candidates, you've probably heard before, I want to apply to USC, UCLA, NYU, Columbia, and AFI. Right. And AFI is a conservatory. It's a whole different animal. But this is generally, the list that the MFA candidates want. Right. And these schools are just so different. And they're so different in so many ways. And the first thing I do is I say, well, why do you want to apply to these programs? Right. It's kind of like saying, I want to go to college and I want to go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Cornell, Stanford, Duke, or, whatever. Right. It's like they're going down a list. But, do you know that if you're a cinematography student, MFA student at UCLA, do you know your thesis film is going to be entirely written as a cinematographer? Right. Well, there's a philosophy at UCLA that exists that causes that, right, that drives that. And they want to understand that they want to know that their students, when they leave, understand light so well that they can actually have a written thesis about cinematography rather than a visual one. Right. Or USC and Columbia. Do you know how films get made at USC and Columbia? At USC, you don't pay for your films. Okay. But what happens is if you go to sell those films later on, and a lot of thesis films do get sold, they never get sold for a lot of money, but they do get sold. Okay. USC will pay for your films while you're there as a student making those films. Okay. But USC retains ownership of those films. So that affects what you can do with it later on. That affects if you collect money, if you sell it, right? And it's one way of going about it. Columbia has a different way of going about it. At Columbia, you pay for your films. A lot of students don't like that. A lot of students complain about that, right? But Columbia has a specific philosophy that really drives this in two ways. Number one, they cap the budgets for their films. So if Columbia says you're going to go make this film and you have to make it for $3,000 or less, they feel that they're really going to cause you to stretch and push and be resourceful to get this film made. And they think that that's a more worthwhile creative endeavor, right? The other point is you own your films. If you sell your film, you retain all the rights to it, to sell it, you get all the money from it. And that, to some people, it might not matter. To some people, it really does matter. I sold my thesis film when I was an MFA student at Columbia, and it wasn't a lot of money, but it felt good that I got to keep that. And that's something that I want to make sure candidates know. When you get to sort of that other list on the right side of the screen, there are other really great programs, and I'm sure you'll all recognize there's a mix of programs here that are MFA, BFA, even some BA film studies programs, right? Wesleyan is a great example. Working with undergraduates, especially undergraduates who are strong academically, I'm always sort of encouraging them, to consider a school like Wesleyan, where you're just going to get a BA. You're not going to get a BFA. You're not going to spend that much time in studio like you would at NYU or USC or someplace like that. However, at Wesleyan, right, you still get plenty of production opportunity if you're a film major. There's a wonderful network in the industry, right, from Wesleyan. And so there are some schools that should really be considered like that. And usually students are resistant to that. They have BFA on the mind, right? But it's an option to offer them that, quite frankly, a lot of parents really like. And you're certainly not going to lose anything cinematically, going through Wesleyan as you would to most of these other schools. So my point is, really make sure that you understand the schools, because you have really two sides to the coin here, right? And I'll sort of move forward with this thought. I tell our candidates all the time, looking at this admissions process, you have to look at it a little bit like an athlete getting recruited, right? The great athlete at USC, the great football player at USC, well, there might be a little bit more academic leeway to help get that person in, right? A pretty good football player at USC might not have as much of that leeway. Same thing at many of these film schools, right? Especially, by the way, the undergrad, okay, where academics is a really big deal, and some of your best undergraduate film programs are also incredibly competitive academically, right? If you have this amazing portfolio, well, there might be a little bit more leeway with admissions, right? But if your portfolio is pretty good, then your academics are going to have to just be that much more outstanding to have a shot at the places like USC or NYU. So it is a bit of a sliding scale, and part of what goes into that I really wanted to stress today is make sure your candidate really understands the school, really understands the program they're applying to, and really understands how much these programs differ from each other in big philosophical ways, right? USC is known for its aesthetic. Columbia is known for its storytelling, right? They're aware of those stereotypes and they work to improve those stereotypes, and they're not entirely true, but they are somewhat true. And make sure they really understand what they're applying to, and obviously make sure you understand that to be able to help them and guide them in the best way possible. It's amazing that we're already sort of running out of time here, but I just wanted to jump back for 1 second to the cinematic personal statement. It really is a whole other animal that warrants, its own discussion. But suffice it to say, it's not about how your client always loved making movies in the backyard with his or her friends, right? That's the bar. Actually, USC actually says that in their prompt, right? Like, everybody who applies to film school here loves making films, has loved making films, right? You need to give them more than that, and you need to give them so much more of what's really in your gut. And I'd be happy to chat with anybody about that at any point. And without further ado, I think I should say thank you, and maybe we can swing it back to Evan for one moment, and we can stop the recording so that I can then share some clips with you, and we can then move to questions.